Great.
Okay, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Mark Aedy, who's written a memoir of his father's experiences in aviation before, during, and after the Second World War. His father, Ken Aedy, who lived through a period of extraordinary innovation in aviation, from biplanes to fast jets, is the title of the book. And that really kind of takes us on our journey to begin with. So, firstly, welcome, Mark. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Well, Nick, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And in fact, you've been rather too generous about me because actually it's Dad wrote the words. So
Oh,
he
I see.
deserves all the credit. He deserves
I
all the credit.
see.
So
I see.
all I've done is put a few photographs, pictures of all the planes he flew together, hopefully to do his story and his narrative justice. That's the aim anyway.
I see. I see. Okay. So tell us firstly, let's talk about your dad, and and his life in aviation from the kind of beginning, middle, and end. If we can sort of focus on that.
With pleasure. So Dad signed up to join Southampton University Air Squadron in 1942, very eager to join the Royal Air Force. And in 1943, he was sent over to the United States to learn to fly, to be taught to fly. I'm sure you will know, Nick, during the war, it obviously wasn't safe to train in the UK. So pilots were sent off either to South Africa, Canada, or the US, and Dad got the US. We can go into more detail about his time learning to fly in Oklahoma, but once he was taught to fly in 43, he came back and transitioned from onto heavy bombers, flying Wellingtons, and then operationally as a pilot, he flew Lancasters both in operational bombing raids, but also participating in the celebrated Operation Manna, the dropping of food supplies to the starving Dutch, and returning prisoners of war back to the UK after their great march back from
Right.
Poland and Germany. Unlike many of his peers, he elected not to decommission and stand down. He was so in love with flying that he elected to stay on in the Royal Air Force, and then was posted to Egypt at the time of Israeli independence, and then to Singapore, where he met my mother in 1952. But in that time, he was transitioning onto fast jets, initially on Vampires, then Meteors, Hunters, and his favorite, the Javelin. So he was very lucky and thrilled to be paid to do something he loved.
Yeah.
And he flew all sorts of aeroplanes, but he saw that transition from very basic aircraft, biplanes made out of paper and glue, through heavy bombers, through to fast jets in a very rapid period of time, over 20 years.
And so the majority of his war service was with Bomber Command then,
Yes.
where was, when he was actually involved in bombing missions, where is he mainly sort of deployed? Where are the raids mainly going? Do we?
So he had bombing missions in places like Dresden, Munster, a number of targets in the Ruhr Valley. And I guess perhaps the most dramatic was Potsdam in the very end of the war in April 1945, which was one of those huge missions. Potsdam, just north of Berlin, was where a significant amount of the army was based. And obviously the Allies were pushing hard to go through to Germany, through to Berlin. He would argue that he was fortunate to catch the end of the war when, broadly speaking, the air battle above Germany was won by the Allies. Having said that, on that Potsdam raid, he did get attacked and followed and shot by a Messerschmitt 262, which was the first operational jet that participated in the war. And that and very soon after that, he did the dropping of food supplies and various other humanitarian efforts. I think the extraordinary thing, Nick, is that having been taught to fly aged 18, he was still technically 20 when the war finished.
Yeah.
And although I think he felt that he caught the end of the war and didn't have anything like the risk of his colleagues, many of whom he lost, the statistics for Bomber Command are pretty harrowing. There were 125,000 bomber crew, 57,000 were killed, 8,000 were injured. So it actually had the highest casualty rate of any division of any force in the Second World War, second only to U-boats, would you believe? So they were enormously brave.
Many years ago in my life in teaching, I spent a summer at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford. Got to meet, obviously it's for the former kind of airbase, and got to meet Bomber Command veterans. And the way in which they were treated after the end of the war, it was extraordinarily shabby. It was really, for a number of reasons. Firstly, at the end of the war, with things like the bombing of Dresden and Churchill's comments of this was a case of overbombing, and there's a lot of kind of moral second thoughts about Bomber Command, and with some justification. It's a very, very kind of immorally fraught area. The whole question of bombing is, and so there was not much of a kind of a hero's welcome for them, but the way in which they were demobbed, seems to be kind of very, very callous. And you have men on these missions, even the ones that weren't injured, who have terrific post-traumatic stress. I mean, the idea, if you imagine what it was to have been like to go up in a Lancaster, this is just unbelievably terrifying, flying through a black cloud. And many of them were very, very unwell physically. There was terrible tuberculosis amongst the bomber crews. And so your dad kind of stayed in, but how was he at the end of the war? Was he in a good way, or was he quite affected by everything?
Well, I think you raised some very important sort of moral and philosophical questions. Bomber Command and the strategy adopted by Sir Arthur Bomber Harris has been frequently re-examined with a degree of sort of post-event, post-hoc rationalization. I'd say a number of things. One, when I challenged Dad, Dad sadly faded away in 2001. But by that time, I was 40 years old. So we used to have a number of conversations about this. So I'll say a few observations. I did ask him how he felt about the whole issue of area or pattern bombing, and the potential that women and children were killed as a result of that bombing. And I think he felt very uncomfortable about it. But his response was, and he would look me straight in the eye, and with a view really to closing the discussion down, he was a very kind and gentle man, my father, but he said, look, Mike, you need to understand that by the back end of 44, we've been in conflict for 5 years. We were aware of the concentration camps, and the war needed to finish, and we needed to find a way of finishing it. And also, importantly, Mark, I was doing my duty and responding to instructions.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, I think he felt very uncomfortable about the non-military impact on civilians. I think he was frustrated that Bomber Command never got its own campaign medal. He talks in the book about that. He says, though, that people forget that people like Coastal Command and Transport Command equally didn't get a campaign medal. So he felt that he wasn't alone. I think he would have been thrilled by the arrival of the Bomber Command Memorial in Green Park, just opposite the Royal Air Force Club in Piccadilly. I think he would have thought that was an appropriate image and means of people remembering. But look, going back to the point about post-traumatic stress disorder, he talks about that in the book in the sense that, nowadays we would have been much more sensitive, much more aware of it, and much more supportive. My father sadly had the first of 3 heart attacks in 1973 when he was only 49. And there have been moments when me and my family have speculated whether either the experiences in the war or early operations in fast jets had an undue impact on him. And of course, we'll never know. But the truth is, Nick, he just adored flying, and he was very keen to carry on and participate in that technological transformation.
Yeah. And of course, the war is this period of immense innovation, particularly in terms of sort of aerial bombing, where a lot of it is kind of trial and error, and because he's flying missions by 1943, so a lot of a heck of a lot had been learned by then already. So was he, when he finished his at the end of the war, kind of one of the more experienced people that the RAF had? Was he?
I'm not sure I'm really know the answer precisely to that. He had done a good number of missions. He'd done a lot of flights in Wellington's training and then in Lancaster's before he was allowed to go out on missions. And because of the casualty rate, almost by definition, everybody was very young. So he was 21 on the 29th of May, 45. So technically still 20 when the war finished. And by the way, we launched the book this Wednesday at the Royal Air Force Club when he would have been 100. And it was a wonderful occasion in support of the RAF Benevolent Fund. I think Dad would immediately say, I can feel him standing just on my right shoulder saying, Mark, don't overdo it. There are a lot of people who made the ultimate sacrifice, but also did some extraordinarily brave things beyond what my father did. I mean, he talks at length in the book about those very brave people who were pathfinders, who'd sort of done a couple of tours of duty, 35 missions each. I mean, with that hit rate, I just don't know, Nick, how you do one flight and then knowing that casualty rate, going to the second flight. So, but if I may, I'll tell you an amusing story about his age and relative lack of experience. On the returning of POWs, which he did in early May 45, when they'd done this great march back from Poland and Germany, he flew over with his squadron to a former Luftwaffe airfield in Juvincourt in northern France. And it was a grass airfield, and the Lancasters were too heavy for the grass. So they needed to get the prisoners of war in the plane super quick to get them back to Lincolnshire for onward transmission home. And Dad said the day was a beautiful day. And in front of each Lancaster, a phalanx of former prisoners of war were seated, ready to embark on the plane for the journey back. And my dad was immensely proud to be doing this humanitarian effort. And honestly, I can see him standing up in front of them saying, I'm your pilot for today. What a privilege. Thank you for your service. And he's going through his speech to them before hurrying them on board before the plane sinks into the grass. And a Canadian Army captain who looked after his phalanx in front of the Lancaster edges up to him and whispers in his ear, and he says, "It's not happening." To which Dad says, "What do you mean it's not happening? The plane is sinking. We need to go, and it's urgent." And he said, "Well, they don't want to get in the plane with you." To which Dad says, "Well, why not?" And he said, "They think you're too young." To which Dad says, "Well, look, just so we're clear, I did actually fly the plane here this morning. I did learn to fly in Oklahoma in 1943. I have been operational over Germany. And by the way, I'm the only pilot." Anyway, the captain insisted, and he said they'd been through too much to have this. And Dad said they were in a shocking state. emaciated, tattered clothes, etc. So Dad sort of gets the message and walks firmly back to the temporary crew room and says to his engineer, who's 36 and looks 36, he says, "Alf, go and get them into the plane and go and sit in the pilot's seat so we can get going." To which Alf says, "Skipper, I can't fly the plane." So Dad says, "No, don't worry about that. Just get in there, get in the pilot's seat." And Dad climbs on the tail of the Lancaster over the top, opens the hatch, climbs in and flies them back.
Heavens.
Quite something.
It's and that's that kind of spirit of wartime improvisation, isn't it? But I mean, again, going back to this experience that I'd had many years ago. A lot of originally I was doing a kind of a project on American pilots and the B-17s that flew from Duxford.
Yes.
And their pilots obviously they're all young lads.
Yes.
When you hit your middle years, the idea that you had these boys, sort of 19, 20, 21-year-olds flying these terrifyingly dangerous missions. The Americans flew during daytime in this diamond formation, which is, you can't. It's beyond imagining how terrifying that would have been. But I think there are things you can get a 19-year-old to do that you can't get a 35-year-old to do. I think as time goes by and you get on a bit, your appreciation of risk and danger and mortality is really quite different. And I think that's perhaps part of the appeal of having guys of that age. But what would your father perhaps have made of that?
I'd make a number of observations. One is at the beginning of the book, when the war starts and, he's sort of 16, he actually talks about being very excited. So an awful lot of his friends were very excited and extremely keen to get commissioned. And Dad just became committed to join the Royal Air Force. And I find it almost unconscionable that somebody would be excited about the scale of participating in the conflict of that scale. And by 1942, when he was at Southampton University, he was just desperate to contribute, to participate. So I think these days it's quite difficult to comprehend the scale of commitment. But of course, by 42, 43, they were in year 3, year 4 of the conflict and under siege and under rations. Lots of people lost their lives in the bombing raids in the UK, etc. So I think there was a high degree of motivation. That's the first thing I say. The second thing I say is throughout his career, Dad was enormously complimentary about the bravery of the United States Air Force. And I'd reference two things. One, the thing you've just referenced, Nick, the Flying Fortresses flying in daylight in 44 and 45 was just immensely brave. The casualty rate was even higher moments for that for very obvious reasons. And the RAF flew at night, and he had immense admiration for their bravery, and they were his age, very young. The second thing he would reference was when he served in Korea, he saw an awful lot of the then jet aircraft flown by the United States Air Force pilots, which really stayed over North Korea at the maximum element of their duration. And, they'd almost fly back and stall without fuel right back at landing, taking immense risk, bearing in mind how dreadfully captured pilots were treated in North Korea at that time. So I think he held them in very high regard. The other thing is, he loved his training in Ponca City, Oklahoma, Nowheresville, Oklahoma. In 1943, he was incredibly well treated by the Americans. So he I think if he could have wangled it, he would have liked to have been seconded to the United States Air Force, hoping to go to San Diego or Florida. But look, they're a different generation. I guess I put a question back to you, whether the this the generation now of that age, whether they would show that level of commitment. Somebody who's 18, 19, 20 is younger than all my three children. I just don't know the answer to that, and I guess it depends on the circumstances.
Well, there are widespread tales, and they're too widespread to be just purely apocryphal. There are widespread tales in 1914 of young lads from kind of Glasgow to Barnsley to London lining up outside recruiting centres to join the British Expeditionary Force because it was going to be really exciting. I mean, and it is an adventure with your mates, and modern life in Edwardian Britain is perhaps, if you're an 18-year-old lad, quite dull. And so this is not a new thing. Where we are in time now, historically, we have a century of terrible carnage to look back on, and perhaps sort of kind of culturally, the sense we make of the world is something really quite different. And so, but then we're not in, even though we have a war in Ukraine at the moment, Great Britain isn't in a war of national survival right now. It's hoping we never are in one. But in 1939, not necessarily in 1914, I don't think, but definitely in 1939, we are entering a war of national survival.
In jeopardy, absolutely.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. And so, potentially, one's view of the world is really something quite different. After the war, obviously, am I right in thinking your father took part in the Berlin airlift? Is that right?
He did something that became the Berlin airlift. So he did one mission very, very early on, dropping food supplies into Berlin, and in fact escorted over German airspace by the Russian Air Force, which he felt rather uncomfortable about so soon after the end of the war. And I think that was in 1947 or 48. After that, for a sustained 2-3 year period, the Berlin airlift took place seriously, so to speak. So Dad did one mission in the Berlin airlift. He actually got posted in 48 to Egypt at the time of Israel's independence. Right. When there had to be a number of missions over Israel just to make everybody sort of concentrate, so to speak. So he didn't participate in the fully fledged Berlin airlift, but at the very early start of testing it out. Yeah. And of course, in Egypt after the war, was still kind of occupied up until the mid-1950s, obviously by Britain, and Britain has a kind of an occupied strip in the Canal Zone. What kinds of things? Yes. What kinds of duties did he have in Egypt? Mainly, there was quite a lot of concern about how the independence was going to proceed, and there was a fair amount
with Israel and Palestine.
Yes, precisely. So, in fact, in some respects, it's a very relevant conversation today. There was as a consequence, there was quite a big detachment of troops in Israel and Palestine at the time in anticipation of trying to keep measured any reaction to the independence of Israel. And part of that presence was the Royal Air Force flying sorties in the region, so to speak. So Dad was not involved in any sort of bombing raids or anything like that. It was more a show of presence and focus as the early days of Israel's independence emerged. And not unreasonably, there was a considerable amount of concern about how it was going to proceed. Right. And look, there were quite a number of terrorist incidents from both sides of the equation. Yes. And I think the British military presence, and indeed others, was there to try and keep that as measured as possible.
Right. You have this situation disintegrating after the war. And I mean, like 1947 is this key year where, firstly, sort of India becomes independent, and you suddenly lose
Yes.
this. The British lose access to this great superpower force that it had in Asia, and then essentially Britain in 1947 kind of throws its hands up with Palestine and says, "Well, we don't know what to do. We'll hand it back to the United Nations."
Yes.
And in 1948, obviously, you have this key moment of where the mandate comes to an end. And so
Yes.
I suppose actually having a military presence in the region, saying, well, if I, to both sides, there is this force here, so think carefully about what you do, is probably a kind of diplomatically and militarily all Britain's actually capable of doing at that moment. But it tells you something. I was going to say, a couple of decades before, it would probably have been a battle cruiser.
Yes, indeed. I completely agree, and I think the rescaling of the UK's military presence globally, obviously the reduction in it really started immediately after the Second World War to some extent.
Yeah.
But of course, that also sort of participated. A key part of his role in the Royal Air Force was being part of the opposition to the emergence of the Soviet threat and the USSR, both in the region but sort of globally, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. And so, when did his career in the RAF finally end? Well, how old?
So he stepped back from the Royal Air Force age 49 in May 1973, and that was partly through ill health. So in January 1973, he was taking me and I was 14 years old, he was taking me to my first ever football match to watch at Wembley, had a heart attack on Wembley Underground Station. And this, it was a tragedy really, because he was such a vital and fit man. And he was only 49, and he subsequently had 2 other heart attacks within 3 months after that.
Right.
And remained beleaguered for much of the rest of his days. He was able to work. He joined the National Health Service for the balance of his career, but was really not particularly fit and well. And then I rolled forward into the late 1990s when I was married with 3 very young children, and my wife rather directly asked my father if he would possibly commit to paper his story in the Royal Air Force, his story in the Second World War and subsequently. And the night he died in November 2001, I was at home with my mother and my sister, and my mother asked me to pop up to his study because she thought he'd committed something to paper. We didn't know anything about it. And I found 80 pages of close type, which takes him from before the war up to 1957, when he was flying Javelins, his favorite plane. And I fear they fade away then because he just faded away. Sad though that is. But you can imagine how thrilled we were to have this incredible record.
Yeah.
Incredibly fortunate. And he sometimes I ponder on him as a bit of a Forrest Gump. He seemed to be in places where lots of things were happening, be it Israel, be it the Second World War, be it seeing General MacArthur in Tokyo, or meeting the King and Queen of Siam in Bangkok, or dancing with Rita Hayworth. He had an incredible time.
It sounds like a life well lived.
Oh yes, he was. I mentioned earlier, he was a kind and gentle man, but he made the world a better place, and very positive. And the book is really a love affair about flying and technological change and how lucky he was to do it.
Fantastic. Well, Mark, we must finish in a moment, but what I will do is place a link to the book in the episode notes for the podcast. So if you're listening and it sounds like the sort of thing that you'd enjoy, or a gift for a relative, check out the link. And as we always say in this podcast, if you're buying the book, please buy it from a local independent bookshop. not one of the big, and who we shall not name for legal reasons, warehouse kind of mail order thingies, because they've got all the money and you need to support your local guys. Okay. Mark, it's been a real pleasure to chat today. And perhaps if you'd like to come back on another time to talk aviation again, that would be a pleasure as well.
I'd be thrilled to do that, Nick, and I'm extremely grateful for you devoting the time to my father's story.
Thanks so much. Take good care.
All the very best. Have a wonderful weekend.